Welcome to this episode of Futures, the podcast series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Hello and welcome to CIPS Futures. My name is Matthew Rock. I'm part of the content team working for CIPS. Today our topic is human rights and global supply chains. Specifically, to use the question posed by our guest today, Professor Michael Posner, what do global businesses owe to the faraway workers and partners who make their products? It's a great phrase from his new book, and we'll explore that during this conversation. Professor Posner has unique credentials to help us understand these issues. He's Professor of Ethics and Finance at the Stern School of Business at NYU, Director for the Center of Business and Human Rights. He served in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. And, most pertinent to now, he's written a fascinating new book called Conscience Incorporated, Pursue Profits While Protecting Human Rights. So, Michael, Professor Posner, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see you.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So the book takes us all around the world, and we encounter labor disputes in Colombia, mineral extraction in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the tedium and the hours worked among content moderators in the Philippines, and you meet business leaders, politicians, activists, NGOs. It's a fascinating read. These are fiendishly complex topics, but I have to say, Michael, you bring through both positivity and workable solutions in the book, and I recommend it to everybody. I wanted to start by asking you, though, where you think we are in terms of the priority given to human rights issues, modern slavery issues in global supply chains by global corporations, because you completed the book in 2024, and you say early on in the book, it's no longer good enough to say for corporations to say we're on a journey, but of course circumstances have changed since 2024, and we've had the election of a Trump administration and a rowing back of many commitments around ESG. So where do you think we stand now versus when you completed the book in 2024?
So I tend to be an optimist across the board, but there's clearly been a couple of setbacks. One is the Trump election, in which I'm very aware of being in the United States, and the deregulation of business by the Trump administration. They backtracked on a whole range of things, which I think make it more difficult and make it easier for companies that don't want to deal with these issues. The other thing that's a challenge is the regulatory environment in Europe, especially with the EU, has slowed down. There was a due diligence directive that was supposed to go into effect. They've now postponed it a couple of years. The German government in particular has said, we want to revisit all of this. So I would say there's a bit of a pause right now from where we were a year ago when I was finishing this book. But the long term is clearly in the direction of greater attention to these issues, more visibility to these issues, and more regulation. There's no doubt if we look out 5 or 10 years that there's going to be more of a regulatory environment, regulatory structure that companies are going to need to pay attention to. And so my message to companies is don't wait for it to happen. Start to put these systems in place now so that you're ahead of the game and you're doing the right thing.
Right. Do you think that those who wish to make a positive difference in the way, whether within corporations or from the outside, are going to have to make a different set of cases, are going to have to be more robust and forceful in the case that they make?
I think the main thing to me is that within every industry, it's important for competitors to figure out how to work together. It's very hard for one company to get out too far in front, especially if it means they're going to be spending more time, money, and energy working on these things, and everybody else gets a free ride. So I think the challenge is to find industry leaders, not one, but several, and to develop an industry-wide approach so that basically companies are not competing on human rights, they're cooperating and coordinating.
Right, interesting. And maybe we can come back to that further on, because you've got really interesting stories from the apparel industry, the clothing industry there. Just as a sort of, I suppose, as a general principle, perhaps, and you acknowledge in the book that each industry has its own considerations and it will be at a different stage and it will have a different level of visibility, and there are all manner of differences. But when you look at it as somebody who has worked in this world sort of for many years and throughout your career and acknowledged as a world expert in this area, where do you think, as a general principle, organizations and the people who make a difference within those organizations need to stand as a sort of, as a minimum standard, if you like? You use right at the end of the book the phrase, and I noticed it was in your concluding paragraph, about having your eyes wide open. Is that the spirit that sets the minimum standard here?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Basically, for companies, talking about global supply chains, companies that operate across borders have to look, in my judgment, at how are we making money, who's helping us make money, and what are our responsibilities with regard to those people. And the challenge is, you may not be able across a complicated supply chain to know everybody. So I don't expect the perfect, but I do think companies that say, oh, we don't own the factory, we don't own the farm, we don't own the mine site, that's not our problem. That feels to me like a very 1990s view.
Right.
The world is now paying attention. And if you're making money because you're producing things far away, you ought to, at a minimum, have your eyes open and be thinking about what are the things I really need to do, our company needs to do to act responsibly.
Interesting. You direct the book very specifically, and your arguments, at politicians, at the C-suite, at consumers, and at each stage you make the case for things that they can do differently, and you look forward at things that they can do. I'm wondering, many of our members of SIPs around the world are not in the C-suite. They're in the M-suite, if you like. They're the managers and the professionals who are trying to do a good job day to day. It's their job, in a way, to be transactional. That's the nature of their work, and that's how they are measured. I wonder what you would say to that stratum of corporate managers who want to make a positive difference but don't have agency in the C-suite.
I think in every company it's going to be a bit different. The main thing to me is that where you have at least a green light or an amber light coming from the senior leadership, from the C-suite, people at the middle level are going to make it happen or not. So my advice to people in the middle management positions is, think about what will it mean if we have the ability to really move forward on these issues. What would we do differently? And how do we begin to think about what the systems would look like to make sure that our company is really following up on the promises we're making? Lots of companies make promises, and then there's nobody actually sitting there trying to figure out how to implement them. So I think a lot of the responsibility lies with people in the M-suite, the mid-level people, who are day-to-day trying to figure out, we're procuring products. How do we do it? What's the system we have in place for doing it? Yeah. We put together a few years ago 13 metrics for buyer-supplier relations, and all of them are cost neutral. They have to do with the design of the product. Is there consultation with who's actually going to produce it? During the production, do you change the order? Do you change the date? Do you make changes in design? What will that mean to, again, in terms of the cost of production? And then post-production, how fast do you pay your business partners? Those are things that companies can do, but you need to be mindful. Those are things that would actually improve the lives of workers. And then you need to gather the data and really figure out how to put that in place in practice. And again, somebody at the mid-level has to be thinking about what's the data we need? How do we mindfully, willfully make those sorts of choices? And even to manage up,
Yeah.
to say to senior leaders, hey, here's something we could do that would make us better. We'd get better performance. I have some ideas of how we might do that.
Right. You mentioned data. I sometimes wonder whether on these issues, you sense that organizations hide behind technology. And, oh, we've got dashboards, we've got tools. We have a very active thread on the SIPS Connect website where people talk about the pros and cons of supplier visits, going to see your suppliers to verify what you're being assured in all sorts of other ways. What about that good old-fashioned kind of feet on the ground aspect to ensuring that your supply chains are what you think they are?
I think that's an important piece, but it's not the only piece. And I think over time, we've seen people talk about audit fatigue, that there are multiple visits to the same factory by different companies. And at the end of the day, there's an inefficiency of that. You sort of know at some point what's going on. And then the question is, what are you going to do about it? So I'm absolutely a believer. You need to get out in the field. You need to see where things being produced or mined or farmed, whatever it is. But then you also need to go beyond simply saying, oh, we did audits, we did visits, to figuring out, okay, we've identified a problem. Now, what are we going to do to fix it to make sure it's not recurring? We don't want to just fix it one time. We want to make sure our system is in place that makes sure that these things are not recurring in the system.
Right. Another sort of specific dynamic within organizations, which I'd love your thoughts on, is the relationship between procurement and sustainability. Two functions that are required to work, well, should be working in cahoots, could work well together, but somehow bring to corporate life different kind of outlooks. And I wonder whether you've observed ways in which they can work well together and productively together.
Yeah, there are some companies now beginning to basically merge the two functions. So procurement and social responsibility, or ESG, whatever you call it, are in the same unit. That makes a big, big difference. And so often we see procurement managers are basically have a mantra, which is we're going to produce quickly, efficiently, cheaply. My job is to get this order done and to do it in a way that's most productive and most economical for the company. And the people doing the ESG or sustainability are sort of a pain in the neck to them. They're coming in and saying, oh, what about the workers? What about this? What about that? And procurement managers tend to say, I'm not reporting to you. I know what my orders are. I'm reporting to the C-suite, which is telling me I've got to get this done in 90 days at this price. And so that needs to be integrated. Again, I don't hold anybody responsible in a negative way. People aren't acting in a out of ill motive or ill will. They're just viewing themselves as having a particular function. And I think smart companies are beginning. I was out Patagonia recently,
Right.
which is a sort of halfway in between a company and a nonprofit. But they very deliberately have said this is all one function.
Right.
And that makes a big difference. You get to know people, so the procurement people know the ESG sustainability people. They talk all the time. It becomes an integrated process.
Yeah.
I think that needs to happen more often.
Interesting, yes, because there's a little section in the book where you talk about values, not value. And actually, these two functions that we're talking about represent those two things. Procurement see themselves as the voice of value, and ESG would see itself as the values hub, if you like.
Exactly. And this is where the C-suite does become important, because they've got to signal we both care about the value and the values. That has to be integrated together. We really mean it. If they're sending different signals to different people in a company, it's not surprising that it doesn't work out so well.
Yes. Can we talk a little bit, or can you talk a little bit about a specific and well-known industry where these issues of human rights are really brought to the fore, and it's a very visible one, and it's the global solar panel industry. It's a huge global industry. Demand is surging, especially in recent years. And yet I think you make the point in the book that 90%, 98% of the ingots and wafers in solar cells and products are made in Xinjiang province in China, where, of course, there is widespread reports of human rights abuses. Can you reflect on this one? And is there a way to address this industry's issues with smart supply chain thinking, perhaps?
Yeah, and so this is an interesting example. There are many where our environmental agenda, the importance of dealing with climate change, comes into conflict with the human rights agenda. Both are important. We have an existential crisis of climate, and we also have, in this instance, workers essentially uniformly across Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, working in conditions of forced labor. So I was asked a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, by people in the Biden administration to come up with the human rights friendly way to get solar panels into the United States. The U.S. had passed a law called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has a presumption that any product coming from Xinjiang is the product of forced labor. Basically says you can't import anything from Xinjiang. Here we have 98% of the ingots and wafers coming from Xinjiang. And I said to people in the Biden administration, you don't want the Customs and Border Patrol to be looking the other way. You don't want to pass a law and then say, don't pay attention to it. And I recommended to them that they have a 3-year waiver to recognize right now there is no alternative to Chinese Xinjiang-produced solar panels. Take 3 years, recognize there need to be alternatives, and then put some resources behind looking for those alternatives. South Korea, Vietnam, figure out a way to build an alternative industry. I think that's the sort of thing, in the case of solar panels, we should not all be beholden to one country that, unfortunately, at least in this one province, is deploying workers using forced labor as a matter of course. It's not a once-of occasional thing. It is a routine occurrence.
Are you hopeful that those future supply chains are being created?
Slowly. I don't know that it's 3 years. I mean, one of the reasons I said 3 years is people do a lot better if they have a deadline.
Yeah.
And if there's some resources behind it. So without the 3-year deadline and without money coming from governments, Western governments, to reinforce this, it will happen, but it'll happen more slowly. So there's no question in my mind that people are saying, with regard to solar panels, rare earth, a range of other things, we have to find alternatives. We can't let this be entirely in the domain of Chinese enterprise, but it's going to happen at a slower pace without government really pushing.
Right. This obviously is a well-known example of a global supply chain where there are clear human rights issues and abuses taking place. I was very interested in your chapter where you visited Foxconn, and you talk in there about the issue there being the sheer tedium of work affecting many workers. I wonder where, if you're a procurement or a supply chain manager, mindful of these issues, where would you be looking next? There are many issues that we know about right now, but what are perhaps the hidden corners and the hidden issues that perhaps will come through in the next few years?
Well, on those issues at Foxconn, it was striking to me. I went in to watch them building iPads, and I focused in on a guy who was putting 4 screws in the iPad, and he had to do, I don't know, 100 an hour or something. I mean, he had, the conveyor belt was moving pretty fast, so he's sitting there putting 4 screws in over and over again. And I afterwards met a guy named Terry Guo, who's the founder of Foxconn. And I said, you know, you've got a lot of problems here. You have 15% turnover a month. You're paying a fortune to train people. Why don't you think about some ways to give workers alternatives, including switching people around? Toyota and some of the auto companies have found ways to break the tedium by finding alternative ways alternative jobs for people, move them around so that every day is not putting those 4 screws into the iPad. He didn't take that. So in fact, his solution was we need less workers and more robots. So I'm not quite sure I persuaded him
Right.
to do anything other than to automate more.
Interesting. Yes. And are there industries emerging where you think there are new human rights abuses potentially sort of latent and under the surface, or do we generally know where the issues are? It's just our challenges in actually addressing them and changing them.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the industries, whether you're looking at mining or you're looking at manufacturing or fishing or farming, we have a pretty good sense of what the challenges are. The one place where we're going to see tremendous new challenges is with the advent and fast-moving AI space. Lots and lots of people at different levels are going to be rendered obsolete. Lots of jobs are going to be taken by machines. And I don't think we've begun to realize how that's going to affect economies, not just of low-wage workers, but of accountants and lawyers and others who are going to all of a sudden find themselves out of a job. And I think that's a societal problem. But I think, again, the industries that are automating using this new fantastic technology have some responsibility to think about how do you retrain, how do you think about alternatives?
Yeah.
That's going to play out over the next 10 or 15 years, I think, quite dramatically.
You have a chapter or a section of the book around the regulatory interventions that are taking place, and you talked a bit about this earlier on, and you're clear through the book that addressing global human rights abuses in supply chains is not just a job for government or for business or for consumers. It's a sort of collective responsibility. But those interventions by governments, regulatory ones, are taking place. And I just thought I'd quote back at you because I was struck by the sort of damning nature of this comment, or maybe it's how I read it. You said it is just too easy for companies to say that they implemented programs while continuing to foreground internal management structures and policies at the expense of actual performance and outcomes. So I just wonder, with these regulatory interventions that are being made, the EU's due diligence directive, are you hopeful that these can make a positive difference? You talked before about them being kicked down the road a bit. I mean, how and when and where will they make a positive difference?
I'm hopeful, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And it doesn't trouble me so much that there's been a delay in implementation, because I frankly don't think the EU was really ready to figure out how to do this in a practical way. To me, you start with the fact that every industry is different. You can't just have a cookie cutter and say, we're going to have a due diligence directive without recognizing mining is very different than technology, social media, which is very different than farming. And so I think at the end of the day, companies in an industry need to be in a conversation with governments about here's what our industry is about. And together and with civil society, they need to figure out industry-specific standards and metrics that are for real, that don't just talk about how they have a sustainability report or they have a group called CSR. That's not good enough. At the end of the day, you need standards, metrics, and an honest-to-God way to evaluate performance, outcome, and some accountability. That's where government comes in. Government can provide accountability, but it needs to be to a commonly agreed standard. The industry itself needs to be bought into that. Okay, these are the issues, right, and these are the metrics, and then we're going to have some way of evaluating in a meaningful way. Again, not perfect. I don't expect any company to be perfect in this pretty complicated global world. But we need to get beyond the fact that we're just asking every company to say what due diligence is. They're all going to define it differently. Yeah. And they're rarely going to define it in a way that's ambitious enough to say, oh yeah, we found these problems, and this is going to cause us to have to spend a lot more money. That's not reasonable. Companies are going to, due diligence makes a lot of sense. If you're buying another company, you want to make sure there isn't a hidden lawsuit or something you don't know about that's going to make your investment less worthwhile. To ask a company to define its own due diligence on human rights is asking them to say, oh, here are weaknesses in our system that we've got to spend money to fix. That's a tall order, and I think most companies are going to have a hard time doing that.
Right, right. I'd like to conclude perhaps with a positive story or a story of an industry where there has been real progress made, and it's the clothing and apparel industry, which is one where you've been involved for many years, and perhaps you can share a bit about that. But from the outside looking at it, it's again a fantastically complex industry with lengthy supply chains that traverse the world. And yet there have been steps taken, such as the Fair Labor Association, which I think you were involved with, and also the collaborative working between many of the big brands that we're very familiar with, the Nikes and the Reeboks of this world. Can you maybe just tell us a bit of the story of what the global apparel and clothing industry, footwear brands have done right, maybe that can inspire others?
So this is really a story that was based on the fact that there was a public crisis, reputational crisis for Nike and Reebok and Adidas and these big global athletic companies, athletic apparel, in the 1990s, sweatshops. Nike became a kind of poster child for sweatshops. And the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, president, invited those companies in and some others with unions, NGOs, and universities and said, we've got a problem with sweatshops. You go figure out how to fix it. And we had a meeting the next month in the old executive office building, and Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor, said, the fact that we're having a second meeting means that this has exceeded our wildest expectations. So we're not off to a great start, but nobody wanted to leave. And the secret of this was 1996 till 1999. Everybody wanted to make sure that they weren't the one that walked away from the table. And so we did that hard work of developing standards, metrics, and we set up this group, the Fair Labor Association. Some of the companies dropped out, some of the American unions dropped out, but there were enough that hung in there, including these big apparel athletic brands, who said, if we do this together, we give each other protection, we don't have free riders, we're all in the game together. And over 25 years, it's really changed the industry. There's no reason in the world other industries can't do the same thing. And again, I think with help from governments need to say, this is our expectation, we'll help you do it, but you, the companies in the lead here, need to figure out how do you make this work. My book says, pursue profits, but act responsibly. That's what it looks like. And we really do have a record of success. 40 big apparel companies, 112 brands, now 10 companies in the agriculture sector working together. They really are held accountable every few years. Each of them have to be evaluated independently according to these standards. And there's just no question that their performance has improved.
Right. So with the industries that we are now creating, you mentioned AI before, and we look at the social media giants and the technology giants that are throwing off in perhaps ways that we don't fully understand, human rights and labor issues. Would you be saying, is your message to those kind of sectors, look at what was achieved with this sort of concerted effort in the apparel industry? You can make the same progress.
Absolutely. Now, companies will always say, oh, our industry is different. Fair point. But the premise of this makes sense. Companies that are competitors ought not to compete on human rights. They can't do it alone. A trade association will never provide the right answer that will be credible to everybody else. So you need companies, you need civil society, And ultimately, government plays a role as well. But if we look to where this world is going 10, 15 years from now, the industries that are going to succeed are those that accept the fact we bear some responsibility, can't do it all, we can't do it overnight, but we're going to have a framework that's consistent with everything else we do. Everything that companies regard as a priority, they measure, and they make people within their company accountable for better performance, revenue, return on investment, efficiency, productivity, worker retention. Those are business priorities. Human rights needs to be in that list so that at the end of the day, companies are really evaluating, are we actually making progress in a meaningful way in our performance? Are workers being treated better? Do we have better content moderation, whatever it is? And in a way that will, again, make it easier for governments to regulate and that will protect them from being called out in the way that the apparel companies were in the 1990s for sweatshops.
Fantastic. Well, look, Professor Michael Posner, thank you very much for your time on SIP's Futures. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and safe journey onwards from here, and look forward to talking again. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you.
This podcast has been brought to you by SIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. And if you'd like to find out more information about SIPS, then just head over to sips.org, where you can discover loads of information about upcoming events, excellent training and learning opportunities, more SIPS Futures podcasts, and all sorts of other things. So that's it for now. See you next time.